Welcome to Battle Tested with Tanya Acker. What's inevitable is that there will be disasters. Even as I record this, there is a fire burning in Florida, about 30 miles outside of Miami. The subject of this podcast is a book written by Jonathan Vigliotti, where he takes on the response of the city of Los Angeles and its officials to the 2025 fires that devastated my city, my town, last year. I think that it doesn't really matter who you are, where you live, for whom you voted, whether or not you like the people in office or don't like them. We have a right to be protected. And the people who run our cities, our towns, our country, our states, our governments, however they're constituted, they have a duty to look after those resources and protect the infrastructure that is set in place to keep us safe. So when that doesn't happen, we should ask questions. We should support the people who ask questions. We should listen to those questions, and we should demand answers. That's what Jonathan Vigliotti does in his latest book, Torched: How a City Was Left to Burn and the Olympic Rush to Rebuild L.A. He takes a very dim view of how the city of Los Angeles and key officials reacted to the 2025 fires. And again, don't get caught up in the politics of it. Get caught up in the fact that we are living in a time where there will be another crisis. So if you don't like the way that the people who you support respond to a crisis, hold their feet to the fire and make them do better. This podcast is not about pointing fingers to any particular person. What it is about is shining a light on the fact that living in the moment that we all live in now, we have to demand better. People need to be held accountable. They need to do a better job of making sure that our emergency systems are in place, because the emergencies have not ended and they won't. I don't mean to be so dire and depressing, but that's just life. Jonathan Vigliotti is here. His book is Torched, and this is Battle Tested. Thanks for being here. Jonathan Vigliotti, thank you for being here today. The new book is Torched: How a City Was Left to Burn and the Olympic Rush to Rebuild L.A. So I read the book, and as is obvious from the title, it is a very critical, if not damning, portrait of both the city's response during the fires and the response after. So with all that said, welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Thank you for having me on, Tanya. It's my pleasure to be here. Seriously, thank you for reading the book, and thank you for having me here.
I had another journalist on, Jacob Soboroff on, who also from LA, also wrote a book about these fires. I'm from LA. I was here during that really frightening time. So the book in a lot of ways feels personal to me, because also LA is my home. And I'm interested in your perspective on what went wrong and what's continuing to go wrong. But let's start at the beginning, because there are some, I think one of the really great things about your book is that you both put this fire in context of the city. You talk a lot about the neighborhood, the Palisades, and how it came to be the bustling community that it became in the 20th century. And you also talk about what's happening in Southern California over the last 10 years, just in terms of fire safety, and how these fires have become much more damaging and much more deadly. So let's just fast forward to January 7th. That's the day that the Palisades fire ignited. We know that there were red flag warnings well before that fire started. So as of January 7th, when things are really starting to go south, what could the city have done differently? What should have happened that didn't happen on that day?
It's a large question, and a great question at that, and one that is explored in the book. There was a lot that could have been done leading up to January 7th. And that's a matter of fact. The National Weather Service, they track and forecast weather 24/7, 365 days a year. And they were doing so with this particular system. And the system started appearing on their screen as something of concern starting January 1st. They knew beginning then that there was extreme weather in the forecast. How extreme it was going to grow on January 1st at that point was not clear. But as every day carried on from January 1st to 2nd, all the way up to the 7th, you had an escalation in the forecasts to the point where 2 days before January 7th, that Sunday leading up, 100-mile-per-hour wind gusts were in the forecast. That's historic. Los Angeles has never experienced wind gusts of 100 miles per hour. And on top of that, you had extreme drought at this point. And I say extreme because we hadn't had any measurable rain in the forecast. I think it was 7 or 8 months leading up to January 7th. So you had this perfect recipe for disaster. You had the National Weather Service recognizing it and putting out warnings and calling together every emergency management agency across several counties, including Los Angeles, informing every official and elected leader of this, what could be an emerging disaster. And ultimately, it fell on deaf ears. And that's what I articulate through a lot of sourcing in this book, the warnings that went out, the warnings that went directly to people, including the mayor. According to my sources who I've spoken with, the mayor knew about this weather disaster as it was growing in intensity and still chose not to take it seriously. And how do we know it wasn't taken seriously? There weren't press conferences. There wasn't even a press release that was put out by the city leading up to January 7th. So by the time January 7th comes around, you have 100-mile-per-hour winds in the forecast for later on that day. You still, as of that morning, didn't have a single official warning that was put out in a press statement, in one of the live broadcasts we see on local news where you have officials standing side by side saying, this is what's happening, everybody be prepared. That never happened. And when you don't have a community prepared, you have chaos just ready to boil over. And when the fire did break out, and this was early in the morning, 10:30 in the morning on January 7th, that's what happened. It was chaotic. People weren't prepared for it. People didn't know what to do with it. Officials weren't prepared for it. All the agencies responsible for organizing and responding, they were trying to activate their engines, which should have already been warming up. They were trying to do so at a time when it was too late. And what I saw, because I had a very unique perspective, I responded to this fire shortly after it started. What I saw very early on was that chaos. And it didn't occur to me in that moment that this was a failed response that I was responding to and reporting on. But as the day carried on, it became very clear. I was standing in the middle of something. I was witnessing something that would become both historic in the destruction, but also, as you said, damning in terms of the lack of response.
Well, I think what is so disturbing, as you point out, it was a dry season. So I'm a native Los Angelina, worked and gone to school in other places, but LA has always been my home. We always have fires. We
Yeah.
know we have a fire season the same way other parts of the country have hurricane season. And like we have fires. And in your book, you tell the story of another devastating fire that took place not just 7 years earlier, the Woolsey fire. So it would seem that having one, been in a community that is fire prone, two, been in a fire prone community during a time, which, as you point out, it was incredibly dry. Oh my God, it was like a dust bowl
Yeah.
in Southern California, coupled with the fact that we just came out of the big fire 7 years ago, that it seems that there should have been far more coordination. So let's take it to the top first. The mayor, as we've long known, was in Ghana celebrating the inauguration of the Ghanaian president.
Mm-hmm.
She says she was not warned. There was a point in time where she says she was not warned about the severity of the potential danger. She has said that she's apologized for the trip. I think that she regrets having not been at home when this devastation occurred. But she maintains that she was never warned about how extreme the danger was. What do your sources say about that?
Yeah, and she actually, Mayor Bass, directly speaking to me, said she regretted taking that trip. I asked her if she regretted taking it. This was at one of those press conferences the first week of the fire. And after initially not responding to my question, I pushed back a few times. She said very firmly, yes, I regret taking that trip. Very interesting, too, in those first few weeks, the mayor never at any point denied knowing about any of the weather conditions. I've spoken with many sources very close to her office, her thinking at the time, her awareness of this, and it's become very, very clear that she was made aware of this weather. At some point, she changed the messaging about what she knew and what she did not know. And it aligned with the same time that her text messages with other officials, her emails, communication that would have really shined a light on what was actually going on, the communications behind the scene, were deleted. As the LA Times first reported, they were deleted according to the mayor's office, and the mayor's office confirmed and clarified that her text messages were set on her phone to auto delete after 30 days. That's the messaging the mayor maintains at this point now, that she never knew about the weather. But those that I've spoken with made it very clear that her office, and not just her office, but she herself, was aware of the fire weather, but ultimately decided to move on with a trip. And you talk about the Ghana trip. When I first heard about the Ghana trip, I was responding to this fire. That's when I first heard that the mayor was in Ghana. There wasn't a lot of reporting. There wasn't much made public about her whereabouts at that point. I assumed it was well known that she was on this trip and that this was something that was publicized. And I just missed because you had the holiday, everybody's kind of on snooze a little bit during that period of time. And I thought maybe I just missed this in the news cycle and in kind of that holiday lull. But no, as it turned out, and as the book really details, that trip was confirmed on the Thursday before the fire, which happened on Tuesday, January 7th, within 24 hours of President Biden confirming that she was selected as part of this delegation. She left to go to Ghana. So it was a very last minute trip. It was a trip that aligned with her ambitions and with a lot of her goals as a politician. And she didn't want to miss it. And the trip, specifically that inauguration, was on January 7th. And it aligned with when the forecasts were calling for significant weather. And at that point, a day before she was selected to go on this delegation, she was, according to my sources, informed about this weather. She made the decision, and this is again, according to those close to and familiar with the thinking of the mayor, she believed ultimately this is a forecast. It may not come to fruition. This is an assignment that is historic and it's important, and it is definitely going to happen on January 7th. She ultimately chose to go on that trip with the belief that the worst case scenario would not materialize in Los Angeles. And I can understand that tug of war that happens when you have to make two decisions. And I can understand the need to want to be somewhere. But ultimately, what happened on January 7th became the headline. And in the headline of the fire, in the headline that the mayor was in Ghana, there were a lot of questions that weren't asked at that point. The mayor had been in Ghana for several days. I don't know, Tanya, if you had seen anything on social media at the time of her in Ghana. And that's very unusual for the mayor. The mayor was in Paris for the closing ceremonies. There was a big press rollout, in terms of her going. She was on local news. And then she went, and there were official photos put out across all social media. That was not the case when she was in Ghana. And as I have discovered through my reporting and through the sources I spoke with, that was a decision that was made in an effort to make it look like the mayor was still at least present in Los Angeles. In fact, the only social media posts that the mayor had on Twitter, on Instagram, they were photos and videos that made it look like she was physically in Los Angeles when in fact she was not. Very few people outside her inner circle actually knew she was in Ghana at the time. And before she left for Ghana, she had her office send out an email notifying emergency management officials, which is standard procedure for when you know that there's extreme weather in the forecast. And all that email said was that she would be traveling out of state. It made no reference to out of the country. It also didn't make it very clear that Marquise Harris Dawson, the council president, was going to be taking over as mayor in her absence. So what happened And a lot of this vagueness was confusion. You have the weekend where weather forecasts were growing. The mayor is now in Ghana. You have the acting mayor, Marquise Harris Dawson, not communicating with anybody. And you have all of those that fall under this chain of command, including the fire chief, the police department, the list goes on, that are waiting for orders, waiting to get into alignment. During a weather situation like this, it is the mayor's role to act as commander in chief. That is her specific job. She is a conductor bringing together this orchestra, bringing it in tune. And without her there, and with the confusion over who was actually in control, there was a diffusion of responsibility. And in that diffusion of responsibility, a lot of inaction.
And it also raises a really good question about how the work she does needs to happen. So, for instance, we all lived through COVID. How many times have we been on Zooms in place A talking to people in place C? I've been overseas and taken work calls and not
Yes.
necessarily said, hey, everybody, guess I'm at the beach now, right? So there is a certain there's a certain portability to most jobs. Maybe not to being mayor of Los Angeles during fire season when there are these warnings. Although it's true, though, it was a little, these fires were a little earlier. Like the fire came a little earlier than they normally would in the fire season. But notwithstanding that, you do point out that there were these warnings. And so when the mayor's away, and she has learned about the devastation. One of the things that you also detail in the book, and people should read the book, it's a good read. It's terrifying, not just because it describes a terrifying climactic event, the fire. It's terrifying because of the city's response, frankly. And I do want to keep talking about that because there were times when the mayor would be on these calls and the calls were dropped, like nobody could hear her, she couldn't hear. And there was an absolute breakdown in the chain of command. Let's talk about Marquise Harris Dawson, who was standing in when she was gone. Based on your reporting, and I'm not trying to throw shade or be disparaging, it just seems like he was very much out of his depth and did not appreciate the magnitude of the disaster. For instance, there's a part in the book where you talk about how the then fire chief, Kristen Crowley, was looking for him and said, this is early on, and reached out to some folks, said, I need to talk to the acting mayor. And the response she got was, he said he'll call you.
And I can't tell you how much I appreciate you reading this book and picking up on some of these details. And I'm glad they resonate with you because they certainly resonated and stood out to me as well. And it goes back to that vagueness in that email that was sent out by the mayor's office and how it appeared that a lot of people didn't know what their exact roles were. And from the sources that I spoke with, that was certainly the case with Marquise Harris Dawson. He did not reach out over the weekend to, at least on record that we have from public records requests, and from me reaching out to his office specifically, there is no indication that he reached out to the fire department, that he reached out to the emergency agencies that were responsible for preparing for this potential firestorm leading up to it over that weekend. That was a critical period of time. And even on January 7th, as the weather is now starting to pick up, you start to have wind gusts. You have wind gusts of 100 miles per hour now all but confirmed for later on in the evening, and still not any significant outreach. In fact, when the Palisades fire broke out, Marquise Harris Dawson was preoccupied. He was at a pre-planned city council hearing where he stayed for about an hour and a half. Even when he was notified that there was this fire, he didn't remove himself to then focus on the fire. And that's why you had this disconnect with him not reaching out to other officials, including the then fire chief, Kristen Crowley. That's why Fire Chief Kristen Crowley wasn't even sure that he was the one in charge because of the vagueness of that email from the previous week. And actually what happened, the first call that the fire chief made wasn't to Marquise Harris Dawson. In fact, I am told from several sources that the fire chief didn't even realize at the time that Mayor Bass was around. She contacted Mayor Bass, set up a phone call with her staff, and that was the first time she was notified that Mayor Bass was in Ghana. And so she has this phone call eventually with Mayor Bass. She informs the mayor of this growing threat. The mayor was very supportive, was very calm, saying you have every resource that you need, reminding the fire chief that Marquise Harris Dawson would be the point of contact. They get off the phone. You then have the fire chief struggling to get a hold of Marquise Harris Dawson, Marquise Harris Dawson's aides saying that he will be in touch with you. Essentially, don't call us, we'll call you. So there was a lot of confusion there. You then have the mayor who could have stepped in to really start to whip everyone into shape, to get everyone going back to that conductor analogy, to really get everyone playing in tune. And according to her press team, that's what she did. Except according to the reporting and according to the public records that are out there, and according to those that I spoke with that were there by her side, she went to a cocktail reception where for more than an hour, she was not responding to her phone. For more than an hour, she was getting text messages and emails asking for help, offering help, and there was silence. So there's silence from the mayor. And then there's also silence from Marquise Harris Dawson, the acting mayor. And in all of that silence, there was a lot of guesswork that was happening with the assumption that people were playing in tune when clearly they were not. And I say clearly because the reporting makes that very clear. But I was also there on the ground. I was in the Palisades as this fire began, as it grew, as it consumed much of the community. And I can tell you, and the reason this book even exists is because I knew from my firsthand experience what I was seeing based on all of the other disasters, fires, hurricanes that I've responded to in the past. This was not aligning. We're in the wildfire capital of the West. Los Angeles is the second largest city in the country. You mentioned the Woolsey fire. That happened 7 years earlier. You have all these examples that would show how a city like Los Angeles should respond to a fire like what was unfolding in the Palisades. And nothing was following the playbook. There was just failure after failure.
What is sort of baffling to me as I sort of think about where everybody was positioned as the events were first starting to unfold is I don't, it seems that there was just a lack of immediacy. So, for instance, go back to 9/11, right? Like, remember, then President Bush was sitting in a schoolroom reading the children when he finds out about 9/11. Now, nobody says, why weren't you sitting in the Pentagon looking over at CIA reports? Why weren't you the president? Why, we'd had warnings. Presidents, like mayors, are sometimes called upon to do other sorts of things. So let's just say, like, she's in Ghana because it was a request made by the president of the United States. It was not a small affair in Ghana. There's much to be said for going on that trip, right? So she goes on the trip because mayors take trips. To your point, when you are thousands of miles away and you find out about a major disaster, I would think that then you talk to your hosts. I need a phone. I need a secure line. I need to be in your office. I've got to leave early. And it sounds like that folks at this cocktail party, including the Ghanaian president, weren't even sure what was going on. And I don't say these things because I want to pile on Karen Bass. I think that she's done some great things in this city. But if for people who live in this city, we really need to understand what happened here because there will be another fire. So I say all that to ask you, Jonathan, like, what do your sources say about how she and Marquise Harris Dawson and others, like city officials, how were they processing this fire as it's going down? Because I know what I was doing. I was watching the news all day. And if you remember, even before the Palisades fire broke out, there was another fire in the Hollywood Hills, not far from me, actually. And this was, a friend of mine had been out with her dogs and then came by and she had my dogs. And then she came over and she said, oh, there was a big fire up the street. And there wasn't much news coverage on it at all. And this is an area that was probably kind of right between the Palisades and Altadena. So there was this sense just for lake people that something crazy was happening all day. So now with all of that said, what are your sources saying about what the folks in the city are thinking about the same news.
I can only imagine what was going on in your mind, or anybody else that lived in that neighborhood seeing that smoke rise. Although at the same time, a lot of people, including myself, weren't really appreciative of how powerful the wind could get that day. I knew because my bureau chief was telling me that the wind was going to be bad, but I hadn't seen a significant amount of reporting, leading up to this event that really made me worried that this was going to be one of those events. And the fire that happened in West Hollywood, I don't even think it was given an official name because it was contained so quickly. You had what really was an exemplary response from firefighters, both on the ground and in the air. They acted swiftly. The wind at that time was not too strong, so they were able to put this fire out relatively quickly. And I was actually in the bureau as that fire was being responded to and contained. And I watched it and I remember thinking, see, they got this. This whole day is going to be fine. And my bureau chief was like, the day is young. Like there is more time for drama to unfold. And it was almost like she was conjuring this because, and I kid you not, as I was there in her office watching this on the live feeds that were coming into our newsroom, that's when I got the notification on Watch Duty. It's that wildfire app that is so invaluable.
Thank God for Watch Duty.
Yeah, honestly, Watch Duty is incredible. Everybody should have it because it puts power in individuals' hands. Knowledge is power, and that's giving you knowledge, and it's giving you real-time information based on radio traffic and based on reporters who man that app are seeing and covering. And as I'm watching that West Hollywood fire being contained, that's when I get the notification that there is a fire in the Palisades. And I didn't fully appreciate what that meant at the time. Again, I assumed, they put this fire in West Hollywood out pretty quickly. This is the same time, the same wind conditions. They should, in theory, if they get to this other fire fast enough, be able to do the same. Of course, we know that did not happen. In terms of what officials were seeing at the time, here on the ground in Los Angeles, you had the fire chief that was watching all of this unfold. You had those emergency management officials like Carol Parks, who runs the EOC, the Emergency Operations Center, also clearly up to date, watching live feeds come in of what was going on. But as for the mayor, my sources say she was not plugged in at that moment watching what was going on, even after she was informed. I would say the same. If this was as simple as the mayor chose to take this assignment, even if she knew about the threat of weather, and that was it. And then she was very actively engaged and pulling all of the levers and pushing all the right buttons to make sure everything was working. I don't know if this book would have taken the trajectory that it eventually did to what it has become. But what really happened there, and we've touched on this earlier, is that she kind of unplugged from the situation. And from those that I spoke with, it was almost like she was in this state of shock. There was this realization that two worlds collided all at once. The assignment that she really wanted to go on, the weather that she hoped would not rise to the level of the warnings that had been issued for nearly a week. And sure enough, they did. And I almost describe it, and this was based on a source I spoke with, a let them eat cake moment, where she was there in this state of shock, according to those that I spoke with, struggling to process what was going on, not plugged into what was going on as she was at that party. It's so important when we talk about what happened next, because there were so many steps that could have unfolded that the mayor was in the power to really enforce that could have helped things. An emergency declaration, for instance, would have been step number one that immediately releases resources, not just in the city, but beyond, not just beyond in the state, but the entire country and in other countries like Mexico, so that they come in, and we're talking firefighters, other first responders, to immediately assist, because the big fear being you could lose an entire community. And all indication was that was going to be the case. But that never happened because the mayor was unplugged. Even when she was receiving messages and back on her phone after she left that party, now flying back to Los Angeles, she wasn't fully aware of the severity of this storm. She could not get service for a while on the flight to appreciate how big this monster was, to the point where in one of the text messages that I reviewed, she received a message from the White House directly. President Biden's administration, the team reached out to her asking if there was anything they could do to help. And the mayor at that point still was not fully aware of the firestorm that was growing in the Palisades. And we know this because she even responded saying, I'm heading back right now. I will need your help, but I need to get on the ground first to truly understand what's going on. Getting on the ground was going to take 20 plus hours. And that was 20 plus hours that Los Angeles, unfortunately, could not afford.
What was Marquise Harris Dawson doing during this time? Because he had the power to
He
issue the
did.
emergency declaration. I mean, when that's the whole point of having an acting mayor when the mayor is not present.
He
So,
was
what was the acting mayor doing?
he was in over his head. And that comes from those directly connected to him and from those on the ground. There is an incident command staging area that is set up, and that is a mobile location, the main field hub to operate and respond to a fire. And eventually they settled on this location right on the ocean, Will Rogers State Park. And that's where eventually, and I say eventually because Marquise Harris Dawson was still at the council hearing for about an hour and a half before he left to go to that command center by the beach. When he arrived, he was at that point looking to get a hold and in touch with the fire chief. And we know this from records. And that had been more than an hour and a half into this disaster, and he had still not connected directly with the fire chief. So the person that is now in control of the city, that is in theory the substitute commander in chief, had not actually spoken to all of those below him in the chain of command to figure out what was going on. He wanted to be briefed on what was the latest in terms of the conditions of this fire at a time when everyone was scrambling in the chaos to respond and to figure out how bad this was going to get. What the acting mayor, Marquise Harris Dawson, was doing, who he had been in contact with, that is unclear. It does not appear from any of my sourcing, from any of the records available, from all of my outreach to his office, that he had been in touch with even the mayor at that point. It does not appear that he even knew what his role was. From those that I spoke with, he didn't even have the phone numbers of the fire chief in his phone. He didn't have a system in place to quickly reach out and get information and to respond appropriately. There was this press conference that eventually happened at that staging area. And I don't know if you watched it. I watched it later because as that was going on, I was actually reporting on the flames that were right behind me. But in that press conference, he was talking about how the mayor was heading back. He didn't specify how long it would take, where specifically the mayor was. He had said that an emergency declaration had been declared, but the fact was it actually had not been declared. And from those that I spoke with, he did not understand that as acting mayor, it was his job to actually sign the paperwork to get that machine moving. And he was only informed of that by the mayor herself later on when they eventually connected by Zoom over a conference call when the mayor was heading back. And so those were critical hours where time was wasted, time that could have helped stop this fire in its tracks. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. Then you had the failed emergency evacuation orders. They were never issued. They weren't issued for nearly 2 hours. And those are critical orders to issue and something that no one can really appreciate until they're actually stuck in the chaos of a failed emergency evacuation, which is exactly what I found myself in. Because when I was responding to this fire, we got to the perimeter of the Palisades and almost immediately we were in bumper to bumper traffic. That traffic was the result of chaos. That was the result of misinformation. Residents not hearing a single word from city officials about what to do, where to go, this fire that's happening, not getting anything from them. They had to make decisions for themselves. Do we leave? Do we stay? And what if the flames come very close to our home? So everybody gets into their car and there's chaos on the streets. And that chaos, and this is why evacuation orders are so important, because they contain chaos. They bring control to a situation that could quickly unravel. And without them, the situation unraveled. So you had people in the streets, cars everywhere, blocking every access. And then you had fire trucks that could not get through. And so it was this perfect storm of mismanagement where misinformation, fueled people fleeing their homes. And then you had firefighters and, these poor men and women. And I say poor because when you see their eyes as they're just sitting in traffic, struggling to get through, there's nothing more that they want than to be there on the front lines, stopping this thing from growing into a beast. And they were trapped. They were trapped, and there was no way that they were going to get to the place where this fire began in the Santa Monica Mountains, way up in the highlands, which was essentially a fortress at this point to get through, and a fortress of stalled cars. And all of that comes from misinformation. And you can see just from how I'm describing this, and hopefully it's all coherent, but misinformation leads to so much chaos on all fronts, from the official response to that personal decision to evacuate. And I think so many people that were impacted by this, that live in the Palisades, live in Altadena, that know that chaos all too well, that is PTSD, that is painful memory that they're still to this day struggling to process.
I think the other thing that's a struggle for a lot of people, including me, is really coming to terms with how many critical failures there were during this moment. So not only, we've talked about the mayor, we've talked about Marquise Harris Dawson, we haven't yet talked about the fact that a critical job, I think that the director of public safety, the Brian Williams, was vacant. Like, there was a big job. The person who could have helped oversee and coordinate a response, that position was vacant. Nobody was in the job because the last occupant had allegedly called in a bomb threat. So another critical facility gone. You also mentioned, because it's not like Los Angeles, we are not an underprepared city. It's bloody Los Angeles.
And you just mentioned, and even as you mentioned there, and it's just a quick point, like, and Tanya, I'm glad you picked that up, because Brian K. Williams, he was almost like the assistant conductor. So if the mayor, for some reason, is missing something, there is the fog of war. Sometimes it's easy to get distracted by one emergency, and you don't see the bigger picture from that 30,000 foot perspective. Brian K. Williams, it was his job to sound the alarms too and be like, "Hey, mayor, we have this issue. We've got to get everybody in line. Like, everyone's acting in chaos and out of sync." But as you mentioned, he was under investigation by the FBI at the time for allegedly calling in a bomb threat. It happened in December, so just before this firestorm, and he was suspended. And at the same time, his role was never filled by the mayor. So, the mayor takes this trip, doesn't have critical people there at the table in her absence. And Brian K. Williams was one of them. And I love that you brought that up, because that's just another missing link in this puzzle, where if everyone was there, if everyone was doing the things that they were tasked with doing, I truly believe, and from the scientists that I've spoken with, the people that study fire behavior, we didn't have to lose an entire zip code. Homes may have been lost, but there was no need to lose an entire zip code. And especially in a place like Los Angeles, to lose lives. More than 30 people died in these fires, the Palisades fire and the Eaton fire in Altadena.
The structural failures are really staggering. I mean, I learned from your book, I'd never heard of this agency until I read about what it didn't do during the fires last year, the Interagency Resource Ordering Capability, which sounds like an agency that's intended to organize forces in a broad, diverse, spread out city to manage disasters. That sounds like exactly the kind of agency that you need to have running full bore at a time when you're in a major disaster, but also failed. What happened there? And so it seems like there were just all of these different pieces, these responders who had no coordination. Nobody was telling them what to do.
I mean, this is a system. Think of it almost like, I'm going to put it in layman's terms, or the way at least my brain processes it. And there's probably a better analogy, but almost like a Google Doc, where you see every resource available to you that's locally in the county and other counties in the state and in other states. And then you request those resources. And in requesting them, all of this is put into this Google Doc. So anybody else that's going in, under an official capacity to request resources can see what's already been requested, what is available. Unfortunately, this system wasn't working. And it crashed for reasons that are still unclear. And in that crash, there was a lot of confusion about what was available. There was a lot of doubling down on requests for the same resources. There was the belief that those resources were coming when in fact they weren't, because the system wasn't working. So when we talk about a perfect storm of failure, that just contributed to it. It was one small element. And at that point, would it have been a moment that really could have changed the direction of this firefight? I'm not sure. But it's just another example of how resources that at the very least could have brought in teams sooner to at least contain this fire from growing into the kind of devastating fire that it became. Surely that could have happened had that system been working. But
Well, you just also look at how the different responses took place. You look at what the city did, and then you look at what Rick Caruso did, both to plan for the protection of his structures,
yeah,
and to ensure they didn't burn to the ground. I mean, you drive down Sunset now, like Palisades Village, his development. I'm not talking about the community itself,
yes,
which is a long way from rebuilding. It is standing bright and shiny. We all know he's a billionaire. Yeah, we get it. But once again, this is Los Angeles. If he can get 16, I forget what they're called, like those water tanks
yep,
that
water tenders,
allow water. Yeah, water tenders. If he can get
yep,
16 of those to protect that development, why did we only have two? And I guess
I
this
know,
brings us back to the whole back and forth between the mayor and Kristen Crowley. Like, you have the mayor's advocates, some of the mayor's partisans who said that the former fire chief was deliberately trying to
undermine the
resource
system.
things, right? Because she wanted to make a point about budget cuts. The mayor says that that's not true, but that part, like, I'll just never understand. I mean, I live in Los Angeles. I pay a lot of taxes in Los Angeles. A
Yes, me
lot of
too.
people,
Me
Los
too.
Angeles has, like, right? We spend a lot of money as Los Angelinos to make sure that the city functions. Why does Rick Caruso have 16?
Yeah.
And I know, we may not be as well funded as that, but we could have done better than two. I mean, that's a bomb. That's
Yeah.
shameful.
Let's peel this back because it's so interesting. And telling this story was hard for me because I needed to be really objective because in LA we know Bass and Caruso, went face to face running for mayor together in what was at times contentious. I wanted to remove all of that history just to look at these two different approaches to the response because Caruso's response in miniature, obviously, compared to the city's response, shows what was capable. And as you have public officials saying there was nothing that could have been done to stop this fire, you then have the private sector showing what was possible. And obviously, the private sector being Caruso with Palisades Village. Him and his team listened to the warnings. That week long warning that went out, escalating every single day from the National Weather Service, his team, specifically tasked with paying attention, was doing exactly that and informing Rick Caruso every step of the way of the fire threat. And Rick Caruso said, we've got to take this seriously. And over the weekend, his insurance provider also provides private firefighters. They activated their plan to have private firefighters brought in from in-state and out of state to come on standby as a precaution. These are firefighters that do not take from the public sector in any single way. They bring their own water, so they're not tapping into any of the public infrastructure or any of the fire hydrants. They are entirely on their own, working essentially off the grid in their response. They were staged 2 days before this storm approached, on standby, waiting for anything to happen. When the fire sparked in the Palisades, they immediately activated and got to the Palisades. In the days leading up, they had prepared the area. They had put down fire retardant. They had taken some appropriate measures. If we're looking at this in parallel to the city could have tried to reduce brush fuel loads. They could have pre-positioned their teams elsewhere. The city did not do that. The city only had 2 water tenders for the entire city. You mentioned 16 that Caruso's team had. They prepared. They read the tea leaves. They knew what was going to happen. They knew that if the weather really held, there could be a disaster. And sure enough, that disaster unfortunately hit. And so they were prepared. And there's been a lot of criticism about private firefighters, about the wealth disparity and that gap between the haves and the have-nots. And Crusoe is very familiar with this. He was in part inspired to even get his own private team by Kim Kardashian and her response years earlier to the Woolsey fire, where she had her own team provided by insurance in case the worst unfolded. And the way that Caruso explained it to me, he saw this as a win-win for both himself and the city. His facility there, that shopping mall, takes up several city blocks. That's a significant amount of space and a lot of landscape to cover. His concern was if a fire breaks out, he doesn't want to worry about public resources coming and protecting him. He wants those public resources to be able to focus on the public. He saw it as a win-win because he could have his private team focus solely on his complex as the public teams focus on the public, focus on homes and infrastructure. And he really believed that in doing what he was doing, he wasn't becoming a burden. And in fact, his team was able to help save other businesses outside of his complex and other homes that public firefighters weren't able to get to. And what few people even know is he has two children that live in the Palisades. He could have had his private teams try to protect those homes. He didn't. He had them solely focus on his facility with the belief that with the public sector completely freed up, not distracted by his private complex, that they would be able to get to these homes. And his children lost his homes. So now the other question that you ask, why was the city so completely, threadbare when it came to their response? And you alluded to this. The budget has always been a big issue in the city, specifically the fire department's budget. And Kristen Crowley had been warning about this budget for several years, sending these letters, 12 of them in total, to the mayor's office, warning about the shortfalls, warning about the lack of resources, the lack of equipment, the lack of working equipment, the need for manpower, the need to have money for overtime, for fire prevention, for fire education. And every single time, according to her, that she sent these messages out, these letters to the mayor's office out, nothing was done. Nothing was acted upon. So the mayor, or I should say the fire chief, and this is important to point out, the last of those letters went out in December. And it was almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy because it warned if a major event did strike, she was concerned, the fire chief was concerned that they wouldn't be able to respond adequately. And sure enough, that became a self-fulfilling prophecy because that's exactly what happened. And as the chief has maintained after this disaster, she didn't have a full stable of horses to respond to every section of the city leading up to this fire weather. And so she had to work with what little she had. She was also concerned about spending too much money to hold over teams that were coming out of service and were going to take their day off. She was worried about the money. She was worried about all these things, but ultimately she had to work with the pieces that she had. And it is, according to the sources that I spoke with, one of her biggest regrets, not holding over firefighters that were coming off their shift. But when she looks back and has reflected on the other pieces of equipment that were missing, according to sources I have spoken with, she said there was only so much she could do with fire equipment that she did not have that was operational. And unfortunately, when you listen to, officials talk about their response, when you look at Caruso's private response, you have a tale of two cities and one response that proves what we are capable of doing in the future and improving that, highlighting the failure of the response that happened in real time and at real cost to the community and to lives.
I think it's also important to point out some of the folks and people who didn't fail, yourself included, because at a time where there were no evacuation warnings, talk about a young woman who was trying to flee with her brother from the Palisades, from the Highlands, and couldn't get down. I guess she was told by police officers to go back and shelter in place.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody knew what to do. Like nobody was being evacuated. Doors weren't getting knocked on. And folks in Altadena have certainly raised this issue. I think that the rebuilding questions in those two jurisdictions are a little different, which if we have time, we could talk about for a bit. But in the absence of official leadership, in the absence of our emergency departments looking after us in the way that I think we have a good faith expectation that they should, people did it. So you hear about a crisis taking place in a home of folks you don't know. You don't know these people, but I'm going to let you tell the story of, and don't be modest, because if you don't tell the story fully and completely, I did read the book, so I will interrupt you. I want you to tell people what you did to kind of bring people some relief and calm that day in what was really an emergency situation. You were asked to go check on a home and save some family members. Tell us about that.
Yeah, and I think it's a story of what was possible, in this response. What was possible? I am by no means a hero, and you will understand that as I tell you the deeper part of that story. First, for context, I had been reporting in the Palisades all day. This is January 7th. It's now turning night, and we're outside what is Palisades High School, and it caught fire. No firefighters anywhere around. Across the street, you had Theater Palisades go up in flames. I'm filming all of this as embers are everywhere, and then it gets just too dangerous. So my producer and I, we start to retreat. We stayed in the area for another hour or two, but then it was time to go and get a little bit of sleep before we had to wake up very early in the morning and do it all over again. As we're heading now down Pacific Coast Highway, I'm finally getting some service on my phone for the first time in like 30 or 40 minutes. And I'm looking at my cell phone, looking on my Instagram, because I've been posting a lot of videos and photos on Instagram and Twitter. And I get a message from one of my colleagues, Jolene Kent, that says her friends have 3 dogs in their homes, in their home. The dogs are trapped. The friends, this couple, husband and wife, they're not there. The wife was in China for work. The husband had been at work as well. And because he was unaware of the fire threat, by the time the fire happened, there was no evacuation plan. There was no plan to get those dogs out. And when he got to the Palisades, it was unfortunately too late. There were blockades he couldn't get through, so they were helpless. And my colleague asked if I could go and get these dogs. And it was late. My producer and I were exhausted. I'm reading this message to my producer, and I'm like, the firefighters will get these dogs. Like, we don't know what we're doing. But then I remember looking through the window of our car ahead of us, looking in the rearview mirror behind us. All I see are flames and smoke. I don't see any firefighters, any first responders. And I look to my producer and I say, we've got to go and try. We've got to go and try. And I should also say, part of me was also like, is there any excuse I can make about not trying? But damn, I saw this message on Instagram. It says read, like it says seen. Like I
can't act like
I can't be that person. And I say I'm no hero, and that's what I mean. Like, I was coming up with every excuse in my mind to just like not show up. And I was finally like, we got to go back. And this was one of those moments where I really realized, like, maybe the firefighters don't have the upper hand on this because we don't see them anywhere. And so we now drive back to this address, and it took 10 minutes to get through. It was about 4 miles. It took us to a different part of the Palisades than where we had been previously reporting, and which is to say new territory. And just like the older territory we had seen, there were no firefighters. And we finally get to this street, Lockman Lane. And on the left-hand side of this street, all of the homes are catching fire. On the right-hand side, where the home that we're going to is, they haven't caught yet, but embers are flying everywhere. In the backyards, there are flames. So the fire is really like closing in. And we act very quickly. I had asked my colleague, what should we do when we get there? She should just break the window. There was a chair right in the front of the main entrance. I break this window that ran the length of the door, and we slipped through. We grabbed one dog very quickly, bring it into the SUV. We go back at this other dog that was hiding under a bed, would not come out. We lifted up this bed, grabbed the second dog, put him also in the SUV. And then we go back for the final dog, which was growling, wanted nothing to do with us, was in the dining room. We tried to get, leftovers from the refrigerator. That didn't entice the dog. I then remembered there was a blanket in the bedroom. So I go back, get this blanket, throw it over the dog. get the third dog into the SUV, and now we're back on our way. The houses around this house are now starting to catch, like the windows from that house that we were in, completely glowing orange as the fire was getting closer. And as we're making our way back to Pacific Coast Highway, still no firefighters in sight. And I make that first call the first time I'm contacting the owner, Andrea Pesanetti. And he picks up, I say, we got the dogs. And he just starts crying. And he tells us where he is. We get to this police roadblock where he's not allowed to get through. And we reunite him with his 3 dogs. Tears, a lot of hugging. And he said this thing that just really, like, it landed immediately when he was like, we could lose this home. We could lose all of those things in that home. But if we lost these dogs, our lives would be changed forever. And ultimately, that home was lost. Those dogs would have died inside that home. And I am so grateful for that moment because it was like one of the most life affirming moments for me. And it was also one of those moments that I carry with me. Really shows me how important it is to show up and to say yes when you can. That doesn't mean you'll be able to deliver. It doesn't mean you'll be able to actually complete the mission that you're asked to do. But to be able to show up and say yes, like my life would have been changed forever had I not said yes. And I could have made up all these things in my mind, like, oh, the house is already lost at that point, but I never would have known. And I would have forever been changed by that moment in a very bad way. And that moment serves as an example too. If journalists with no training could have done that, firefighters could have as well. And it's so important to point out, this is not a criticism whatsoever of firefighters. I dedicate my book in part to firefighters because they are the true heroes, and the firefighters that were there, they wanted to do more, but they could not. It just wasn't safe. There weren't enough firefighters to even patrol the area to get to the areas where I was. Their lack of response, their inability to get to these places ultimately came from that broken chain of command. They wanted to get in. They wanted to go to the front lines, but they didn't even know where to go because the people guiding them didn't know where to send them. So
I'm so glad you made that distinction because I think that when people hear your last response and they're like, why weren't there any firefighters at Pally High? Where were they? It wasn't because these men and women weren't trying to get there. They weren't being directed. They didn't know where to go. They were there were so many breakdowns. We've talked about those. I could keep you here much longer, but I won't because I know you have another job. You've been critical of the rebuilding. And I think this goes back to, or at least some of the rebuilding, this goes back to the title of your book, The Olympic Race to Rebuild. And there's something you mentioned. You talk about the difference between efficiency and reckless acceleration.
Mm-hmm.
And as a Los Angelina, as somebody who's excited for the Olympics, as somebody who has been devastated seeing this happen, just the devastation in my hometown has really been devastating. The devastation's been devastating. There's a good tendency, but
it is.
But it's so. I want this city to come back. Like, I want things to happen with not all deliberate speed, but real speed.
Yes.
So what is the difference between efficiency and reckless acceleration? What is the city doing now that you think it should not be doing?
Yeah.
And how do we come back in what you think would be a healthy and non-reckless manner?
So
how do we grow the city back?
No, and another really thoughtful question. And there's more nuance in the book, so read the book for all of that. But what I will say, to try to Cliff Notes version of this, there is this race to rebuild ahead of the Olympics. A lot of this is because of optics. The mayor and the governor knew that losing the Palisades bad for them. Losing the Olympic Games, which was being discussed on the federal level and among aides of President Trump, that was a big concern. And if that happened, it would be game over for the careers of the governor and the mayor. So there was this push to rebuild quickly, to fast track permitting, to really scrub and slash regulations, critical regulations that question how we rebuild, what materials we use to rebuild. The good news with the rebuild, if there is any good news, you have an entire community that is now rebuilding using updated fire codes. A lot of homes in the Palisades were built before fire codes, and so didn't have proper fire codes, implemented in the way that they were constructed. So now you're going to have homes that are built with fire codes. The problem is fire codes, even though they're the strongest in the country in California, they work on a spectrum. And so the lowest end of the spectrum is all you need to meet that threshold in order to get a permit. And that threshold still allows for wood. When you have a community that has been ripped apart by fire, this, according to fire experts, is a time to think outside of the box, to not work with the same blueprint. Unfortunately, working with the same blueprint is fast, and fast is what's needed ahead of the Olympics. Now, fast is not always the enemy of good, but shortcuts almost always are. And there have been a lot of shortcuts, in slashing those regulations, in fast tracking permitting. We are not informing and educating communities about what other materials exist out there that are safer, that exceed that threshold of code, specifically steel and what's known as concrete composite. These are materials that are 4 times more resilient to fire. They are comparable in cost. They are available. They've been used for 2 decades now. They also, in many cases, secure affordable insurance premiums. But nowhere in any of the literature and any of the outreach from any of our local leaders is it being made clear to families that are looking to rebuild that these materials exist. And so I argue in this book, and this argument really parrots what I am hearing from constantly now from fire experts. To rebuild with wood is to essentially set history back, kind of this timeline where if a fire starts again, history could repeat itself. And Erin Brockovich, who I have become very friendly with through this process, she read the book and wrote a blurb for it, and I'm grateful for that. She likened it to the 3 little pigs and the big bad wolf. And if you look at that, the analogy is, you've got straw homes, you have stick homes, and you have brick homes. The straw homes are the homes that were built before code. The stick homes are the ones that are currently being built to that lowest threshold of code. Many of the homes lost in the Palisades were built to that threshold, were newer and built to fire code. They were still lost. As Erin Brockovich has said to me, and as fire experts have also said as well, this is the time to think about building like the pig's brick home, steel and concrete, because the wolf, climate change, extreme weather in this case, that's going to continue to be a threat. The wolf is going to come and huff and puff again. And as that story ends, we know who wins. It is the pig with the brick home. And what concerns me, I go back to the Palisades often, and I see so many wood homes going up. Among all of them, this sea of lumber, I only saw 1 steel home. Now, permitting's been fast-tracked and at a record rate. There are more permits that have been issued than any other disaster in recent memory. But that doesn't mean that rebuilding's happening quickly. There's been a backlog of availability of builders, contractors, engineers. All of this to say, there is hope here. There is a window, but it is shrinking, where homeowners that are waiting to break ground can rethink some of their plans, can rethink the materials they're using, so that we can all build back like the pig with the brick home. And that's what I think our focus needs to be. I think education is so critical. And unfortunately, in this rush to make LA look beautiful for the Olympics, we are failing to inform those around us, residents that are looking to rebuild, of safer ways.
What's happening in Altadena is another reflection of that. I know your book focuses on the Palisades, but I believe there's now an investigation that the State Justice Department has launched in order to determine why there were so many failings for the folks in Altadena who have not had, I think they've had, it's been a much more troubling situation there in terms of rebuilding. Jonathan Vigliotti, before you go, what's your verdict on whether or not you think that leadership, and I mean city leadership writ large, the buck stops with the mayor, but it's the mayor, it's sort of the institutions, the emergency institutions in this city that failed. Have lessons been learned? Are we seeing the wrongs be righted? Is there going to be more attention to detail? Because sadly, this will not be the last disastrous event in this town that I love so much. Has anybody learned anything? Are we going to do better next time?
If lessons have been learned, they have not been discussed openly with the public. I don't think there's a whole lot of clarity about the many layers of failures that happened before this fire. I don't think there's been much discussion about the layers of failure that happened during the response. And there certainly has not been a lot of focus on some of the failures that we're building back into these communities that were lost. I think what needs to happen, I think we need our leadership to step back, to truly assess what happened, and to communicate with the public what happened, and to lay out groundwork for what will be done in the future to make sure this doesn't happen again. Because once you lose trust, once you lose that trust from your constituents, the game is over. You have people that are afraid to move back to a place. I have friends that have left their homes because they're afraid this could happen to them. And I think it is so critical for our leadership to truly analyze and assess. And it's their job to communicate and to reassure those of us that live in Los Angeles and beyond, this will never happen again. And so far, at least for me, and I'm a resident and a taxpayer, I have not heard those things that make me feel comfortable.
Well, not only is it their job, but they sometimes have to be pushed to do it. And for that, Jonathan Vigliotti, I will add my thanks to others who I hope have thanked you for speaking truth to power and asking hard questions. I don't care if the questions are being asked of President Trump or Karen Bass. When you are running things, you are accountable to the people who elected you, and you need to be pushed. And you certainly pushed the mayor on some of these questions, and you forced some answers. And thank you for your work. Again, as another resident and another taxpayer, I am grateful to you for shining a light on this because we got to do better, full stop. And we won't do it until people start talking about some of the things that went wrong. So thanks very much for being here. And everybody, you must read this book. The book is out May 12th. Jonathan Vigliotti. The book is Torched: How a City Was Left to Burn and the Olympic Rush to Rebuild L.A. May 12th. I highly, highly recommend reading this. Thank you for the early copy. It was a great read and really informative. I think that we have a lot of work to do in this town. So thanks for shining some light on that, Jonathan.
Thank you for having me, Tanya. Thank you for reading the book and for using your platform to have this discussion. I really appreciate it.
Well, please do come back.
Yes, I would love to.